Hey there, my fellow whiskey geeks. This is Bill Straub with Modern Thirst, and I'm here with a slightly different type of video than I normally do. Normally we're just kind of tasting whiskeys and kind of letting you know what we think about them. Today I just want to talk about a specific kind of whiskey. We haven't really talked about it or addressed it before, and what I want to talk about is barrel finished whiskey. Now before we start, you should also know that I'm one of the founders and owners of 4Gate Whiskey, and 4Gate Whiskey Company takes American whiskey and we finish them in other barrels in collaboration with Kelvin Cooperage to give you something a little bit different, a little bit unique. So I just want that caveat to be out there. So I'm not trying to sell you on a particular bottle or anything like that. What I'm really wanting to do is kind of explain barrel finishing, what it is, why we do it, and how that impacts what's actually in the bottle. So as we all know, American bourbon whiskey has to be made in America, but one of the key components of that is it has to be made in a new oak container. So you can't use a used oak or a used wine barrel or a second used bourbon barrel. Yeah, it has to be new. So what you find out of that is that overall the differences in the flavors of bourbon tend to be very subtle because they're all using the same container. And we know that the container adds, what, 80% of the flavor and color that comes in a bourbon. So you can change it a little bit by changing up the mash bill. Your yeast matters, the type of water and where it's aged and how long all matters. But overall, the general flavors are whatever type of barrel you use are the flavors you're going to get. Now, in my opinion, you can go to some craft cooperages like Kelvin Cooperage, which is why we use them, why we collaborate with them in the first place. And their barrels are just excellent. Their methods of toasting before they char is just really good. So you can get a little variation out of that. But what barrel finishing is a lot of people will look down on it and they think, well, it's not bourbon anymore. And technically it's true. It's a whiskey specialty according to the ATF and the TTB. But it's not a gimmick by any shape or form. The reason people do it is because what they're doing is they're looking at Scotch whiskey and world whiskeys that have been doing what they're doing for hundreds of years. So you have things like Scotch whiskey. I've got a couple examples here. Scotch whiskey does not have to have new oak, neither does Irish whiskey or most world whiskeys. They don't have to have a new barrel every time. So what they wind up doing is they buy barrels from other places. It could be bourbon companies, so they could be matured in bourbon barrels, and that's from the very start. As soon as that whiskey goes into the barrel, it's going into a barrel that's been used for something else. And it might also be one that's just been used for whiskey before. But they also use things like what's very common is they'll use a sherry barrel, a barrel that was originally a sherry barrel. They'll reuse it over and over and over, but they'll put their new distillate into a sherry barrel and let it age, in this case, for 10 years. In this case, we had I believe, 9-year-old that was in Bordeaux red wine barrels from the start. So I don't think anybody's claiming these aren't whiskey. The difference is that when you're drinking a Scotch, one thing to know is that almost always it is a single malt, which means it is from a single distillery using only one malted grain, and that's almost always malted barley. So essentially the recipe for Scotch is the same recipe for every Scotch. The difference is they can blend these different types of barrel aging together, and they can get from that one recipe a million different flavors. And it's very interesting. Now, in my case, I like Scotch. I'm kind of I've been introduced newly to it, I guess you would say. It's not my thing that I generally reach for. I prefer bourbon, and if not drinking bourbon, I prefer rye. But what I really find fascinating is the fact that you can take that single mash bill of just malted barley and get so many hugely divergent flavors from it that's really hard to do in bourbon. Bourbon tends to be much subtle. The difference between a great and a good, or one brand and another, is more subtle than it is in Scotch. I think that's really interesting. So before we go any further on the barrel finishing, one thing I wanted to mention is that certain things are not barrel finished. They may seem like it, but they're not. So one of them I want to mention, Maker's 46. They take Maker's Mark bourbon and they put it in another barrel. Or it's the same barrel probably, but they put staves of French oak into that same barrel. Now, another one, you could say Michter's Toasted. These are still even legally considered bourbon. The reason for that is because the methods that they use do not introduce a barrel that's been used for anything else. In Michter's Toasted case, which I don't believe they make anymore, they might be coming out with it again this year, but they take their bourbon and they put it in a barrel that's just been toasted, but it's a new barrel. So in both cases, what you're doing is just adding wood, and it's new wood. It's not used. It's never been used for something else. So a toasted or double oaked, Woodford double oaked, for example, the Old Forester 1910. All of those are still bourbons, legally speaking, by the TTB, or Tax and Title Bureau of the ATF. They don't violate any of the rules for bourbon in any way, shape, or form. So the point of that is that they're not used cooperage. So these are not finished bourbons. Even though they've been in a second barrel, you would not consider this barrel finished. When you look at their COLAs, or Certificate of Label Authenticity, it's still a Kentucky straight bourbon for both of these. And that goes for Woodford Double Oaked, and that goes for Old Forester 1910. It's just the way it is, legally speaking. Now, it's different when you get into barrel finishing, and some of the examples I have, I've got barrel dovetail. Belle Meade does a ton of them. They do sherry and Madeira. Both of these are excellent. My own company, Fourgate, our first batch were sherry rum barrels, and we've got some, our second and third batches are getting ready to come out. OKI's done some, and there's a sherry finish rye here from Minor Case, which is Limestone Branch. So what these do is they are aged for however many years in their first barrel. It's a new use barrel. So in our case, we had an 11-year-old Kentucky straight bourbon. It sat in the same barrel for 11 years old. After 11 years, we pulled it out of the barrels and we put it into a second barrel. Those barrels can be anything you like. In our case, they were originally sherry barrels, Oloroso sherry, and then they were used to do a batch of rum down in the Caribbean. So what you get when you put it in that barrel, you don't even leave it in there long. It's going to soak into that wood a little bit, and it's going to draw out some of those flavors that the wood has absorbed from that sherry and that rum. Same case with the Belle Meade stuff. It's the same case with barrel dovetail and Minor Case and all of that. What you're looking to do is just kind of change the flavor, just impact the flavor a little bit. When you do that, according to the ATF and the TTB, this becomes what's called a whiskey specialty. So is it bourbon? The answer is it is bourbon finished in another barrel. Legally speaking, it is considered a whiskey specialty. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's just how it's classified. It's a legal classification. So you're getting into the same argument of whether Jack Daniel's is bourbon or not. Legally speaking, right now, it's bourbon. But spiritually or conceptually, maybe not. They don't like to call it bourbon, I guess, at Brown-Forman, but it kind of harkens back to that debate. Legally speaking, a finished whiskey is not a bourbon. It is a whiskey specialty. So there's a lot of purists who will say, I won't drink my bourbon if it's been barrel finished, and I'm fine with that. I understand that perfectly. It's not a gimmick. It's not somebody trying to, not necessarily doesn't need to be somebody trying to cover up the flavor of their whiskey or anything like that. It's really, American whiskey just doesn't have the ability to be, unless you do that type things, it's very hard to experiment with the oak itself like you can do with Scotch. And Scotch, which has been around forever, is popular throughout the world. You look at those distilleries, you look at people putting out those bottles, and it's not hard to get a little bit jealous. They can get so many different flavors just by changing the cooperage, which we can't do in the United States. So in the end, that's what you get. You can drink a straight bourbon. I'm fine with that. I love straight bourbon. It's 99% of what I drink. You can drink a bourbon finished in another barrel, which is probably the other 1% of the bourbons that I drink. So whatever you like is fine. I just hope this helps you understand a little bit what barrel finishing is, why people barrel finish, where that desire comes from, and where the whole movement comes from. It's not a gimmick by any shape or form. It really is. Using barrels that had previous use is the way whiskey's been made for hundreds of years. It's really American bourbon that changed that and kind of tried to shy away from it. So it's interesting to me, and if you don't like it, if you have a real problem with it, fine, no issues from me. I'm not going to argue with you. If you do want to try something different, then check out any of these here. I love these Belle Meade Select casks because they're at cask strength, and I really, again, cask strength whiskey is the way to go. If you're going to try Scotch, if you're going to try bourbon, if you're going to, whatever it is that you want to do, go for cask strength. Because even if it's too hot for you, if you don't like it, just add a little bit of water. You can drink it at 90 proof on your own, but if you get something that's 90 proof and it seems a little weak and doesn't have really bold flavors, there's no way to take that water back out of it. So, that's kind of what I like. I hope you like it too. If you have any thoughts on barrel finished bourbons, either pro or con, I'm not here to convert anybody or anything like that. Please feel free to post them on this. We love to have discussion. I want to interact with everyone. So check it out. If you like what we do at ModernThirst.com, check us out on ModernThirst.com. We have about 320, 340 whiskeys reviewed on the site. And if you like what we do, again, support us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/ModernThirst. Just $1 a month is welcome and very well appreciated by us. If not, like and subscribe to us on YouTube. We hope you guys have a great day, and cheers.